All right, folks, it looks like we're at the appointed hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar presentation today. My name is John Curlin. I'm an attorney advisor with Equitas. Tell you a little bit more about myself and Equitas in a short moment, but what we're here today to talk about is not just a credibility contest, sexual violence prosecutions that go beyond offender said, victim said. And this is really just sort of a potpourri of strategies about how to overcome that credibility contest that a lot of the defense and maybe some of our fact finders and even us sometimes might want to reduce a sexual violence case to, and how to build it something more than just a credibility contest. As I indicated, my name's John Curlin. I work as an attorney advisor with Equitas. I've been with Equitas for 5 years, and it's a fantastic job because I get to work with prosecutors and law enforcement and advocates, both system and community-based, that are helping victims. But prior to joining Equitas, I worked as a prosecutor in Berks County, Pennsylvania for about 16 or 17 years, where I prosecuted, supervised the prosecutions and personally prosecuted cases involving child abuse, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, homicide, stalking, and things of that nature. That was a fantastic job, and I still sort of identify as a prosecutor or think of myself as that, even though if I'm not formally one, and which is one of the reasons why Equitas is such a great place to work. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Equitas. Folks are here for a webinar hosted by us, so my guess is you have heard about us from somewhere prior today, or maybe you're already on our mailing list. If so, thank you. So I'm going to keep this infomercial as short as possible. But what we do at Equitas is we are a nonprofit with a brick and mortar based in Washington, D.C., made up of primarily attorney advisors such as myself, who are former prosecutors specializing in crimes involving human trafficking, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and elder abuse, things of that nature, the sorts of crimes that attack the most vulnerable of victims in our society and deal with some of the most dangerous of offenders. And what our job is, with that background and experience that we all bring with us to Equitas, is to try to develop and train and learn about practices in the prosecution and investigation of these cases that are both innovative, informed, and mostly practical. Because while we do try to deal with research-based and informed subjects and topics, we also recognize from our own experiences, especially, the everyday challenges and realities of prosecuting these cases among one in a docket. And so we try to develop approaches that recognize that and can accommodate that. So how do we accomplish our missions? Well, here's some of the area, and you can certainly find out more by diving into our website. But we develop and curate resources. These can be strategy guides for prosecutors and investigations in these types of crimes, statutory compilations, publications, things of that nature. All these written resources are freely available on our website and can be downloaded. A couple are too big, so you might to put directly on our website, so you might have to put a request on. We cover a range of issues, and I know when I was a prosecutor, and even now, if I'm looking for a starter on an issue that I don't always deal with, and I'm trying to figure out how to start my research, these resources can be a great help, even when they didn't have authority directly cited in my jurisdiction of Pennsylvania or the jurisdiction I practiced in. It would be a great way to find head notes or case notes for the Lexis users to really start and develop an argument in my jurisdiction. The other thing we do is we have training events. This is a good example of one, a web-based events, but we also do live trainings nationally and internationally. Consultations is another thing we're available for 24/7. This can be really broad or really narrow. It can be broad in the sense like maybe someone is calling Equitas because they want help or advice or just brainstorming about how to develop a multidisciplinary coalition or how to do better community outreach, or just broad sort of more topical or policy issues in some ways. They can also be really case specific as well. You got a challenge in your case, your defense is called an expert that you've never heard of, and you're wondering if there's anyone across the nation who may have heard of that person. You're looking for sample motions in limines or jury charges or instructions, or maybe direct exam or cross-examination ideas, or you just have an issue in your case that you want to bounce around someone with who's familiar and understands these cases. maybe your friends and colleagues who do drug trafficking all the time might not might not have the best insight that you want to really develop the case. This is one of the things we're available for. And if we don't know the answer, we can certainly connect you through our national network, through other experts who do. All these resources, training events, consultations are free of charge because we're lucky enough to be grant supported. And the only exception is for in-person training events. There are travel and per diem costs that need to be covered. If you want to learn about new training events that we conduct or have archived on our website, if you want to hear about new resources we develop that you can use, you can follow us on social media. I'd also recommend, if you haven't done already in your life, go to our website, equitasresource.org, and just get on our email list. You can put your email list. It's in the footer of our the first page that you hit there. And you can also be notified of other opportunities through us and through our other national technical assistance folks that we collaborate with. I see we got one question. Will the PowerPoint be available later? Yes, it will. If you contact us, we can give you a downloadable copy and make that available to you. Thank you, Vicki. Absolutely. Final housekeeping matters, almost at the tail end here. As I indicated, we are supported through grants. In this case, it's provided by the Bureau of Justice of Assistance, Office of Justice Programs. We're always grateful for that support. That's what allows us to make our work available on as broad a base as possible. The only caveat I have to offer is hopefully none of the statements I make today are going to upset anyone or find something that you find too disagreeable. In the event that you do, however, my viewpoints or the views or opinions in the document shouldn't necessarily be impugned to the Department of Justice. I also want to note that a lot of the research and content in today's presentation is built on a foundation created by others, like a lot of good lawyering does. And I just want to put a notice here that the content that we utilize here, that it's utilized all in compliance with fair use law. All right, so what are our objectives? Here's a challenge. I mean, this has been a challenge in cases when I was prosecuting. I know from consultations or technical assistance requests we get, it persists as a challenge. But the reduction of sexual offense cases into just a credibility contest between what an offender said and what a victim said. If you want to reduce it to gendered language, that might be what rings more familiar to people. It's sort of the idea that sexual assault cases, or the challenge in them, and most of them, is just a he said, she said. And how can we ever figure out what's going on? Well, we want to take that down, and we want to sort of get back to some foundational principles. And in approaching that, we want to recognize that that's where offenders are live, and that's what offenders are depending on. That sort of assumption that we won't be able to figure out what happened, that we won't be able to maintain a prosecution and carry it forward. So we want to start digging into offenders, how they operate, how they select victims, and how they're dangerous, not just to victims, but also to public safety at large. We want to try to build this case into something more than just a credibility contest. Once we recognize the pattern of perpetrators and offenders who commit sexual violence, we want to be able to use that knowledge to figure out ways and strategies and tactics that we can identify and collect evidence of that offender's behavior. So we're hopefully not just dealing with a scale that's balanced between two accounts, but we're trying to reveal a little bit more about the offender's planning and manipulation. We also want to learn how to corroborate our victims' disclosure by supporting their credibility and other witnesses' credibility with corroborating evidence. And at trial, we want to recreate the reality. Now, really what this presentation is, because it touches upon so many different areas of sexual assault prosecution, sexual violence prosecution, is that it's really a potpourri of a lot of subjects that we cover a lot more deeply and take deeper dives into other presentations. But really, these different subjects are such as trauma-informed interview techniques, alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, utilizing victim behavior experts, being able to bring all these two tools together and sew them together into one investigative and prosecution effort is what's going to allow us to tip these scales for the victim. in favor of the victim. So it's not just a credibility contest. It's that our jury or reduces as a wash and as an acquittal. Okay, so moving on, what I'm going to start with, and might be a little bit complicated because we do not have much interaction capability here without the chat window available. Maybe we can use the Q&A for it though, is I'm going to present a survivor vignette. And this is about a 3-minute disclosure produced by the International Association of Forensic Nurses from 2008 of Lindsay. And Lindsay's going to talk a little bit about what happened when she was raped. And I assume we have mostly prosecutors in our audience today. As folks listen to Lindsay's disclosure, I want you to start thinking of it from 2 aspects. One, if this case drops on your desk, and of course you get a lot more than just this 3.5-minute disclosure from Lindsay, what kind of things would the defense do to rebut this, to respond this, to defend against this disclosure or prosecution? And what are some of the ways that we would respond to that? And using the Q&A feature, maybe we can have a little bit of a dialogue about some ways and methods which we do that.
We went on about 4 dates, out to dinner, movies, things like that. I would go over to his house during the day. On weekends, just very laid back, casual relationship. And then one day after I was hanging out with him for about 3 weeks at this point, I went over to his apartment before work and I brought him a sandwich for lunch. And I went over there and he started kissing me. And I told him that I really needed to go because I was going to be late for work. And he told me that I wasn't allowed to leave, that I had to stay there. Kept kissing me, started taking off my clothes. I told him to stop. He then proceeded to grab me, one hand on each of my forearms, and throw me down on his couch so that I was on my back. And he came and he got on top of me and he started taking off my clothes. And I was kicking him at this point, and he purposely turned up the music really loud when I walked in so no one could hear me. And he said, no one's going to hear you scream, keep screaming, no one's going to hear you. And then I started kicking him and punching him. And he said, if you don't shut up, I'm going to kill you. And I looked at him kind of like, how are you, just with this look of utter disbelief. And I kept kicking. And he reached under the couch and pulled out a 9mm handgun, and which I didn't know he had, and held it to my right temple. And I stopped kicking and screaming at that point. And at one point I looked him dead in the eye just to see if he had any emotion. And at that point he clicked it back. So I heard the bullet go into the chamber, and I just stopped moving and just kind of let him rape me because I didn't want anything to happen. And he got up, he finished. He picked me up, threw me up against the wall, opened his door and threw me out. I was still completely naked, or half naked from the bottom down. Threw me out, called me a whore, slut, and then slammed the door in my face. And went home, showered, put makeup over the bruises on my face because I didn't want my parents to find out, because for some reason I felt like they were going to be mad at me. Went home, showered, washed my clothes, went down to the dinner table, had dinner with my family, got up, went to bed right after that, told them I was really tired, got up for school the next day, went to school and talked to one of my friends at high school and asked her what I should do. And she said I should talk to the head of school, which is principal. And I went and I told them I needed to see the school psychologist. And so I went and I talked to the school psychologist and I told her what happened. And she said legally, because I was underage, she had to tell my parents because I was in danger. And I said that, I'm sorry, but you cannot tell my parents that their daughter was just raped. I have to tell my parents. So I drove home and I called my mom on my cell phone and I was crying hysterically. And she picked up the phone. She was at work at the time. She picked up the phone and all I said was, I was raped.
Okay, folks, to help facilitate conversation, what I did is as many of the attendees as I could get through, I tried to give you authority or permission to talk. So if you do have that permission and you want to sort of, and you want to share your insights or your perspective verbally on your mic, that'd be great. I just ask you to make sure that when you're not talking, keep your mic off so that we can control ambient noise. But if you don't have audio capability, I'd love to hear from people using the Q&A feature. Listening to this, folks, let's take about 5 minutes or so to just sort of digest this a bit. How do you think the defense is going to frame this disclosure from Lindsay? How is the defense going to attack it? How are they going to cross her? And let's even assume that that on the stand, she sounds pretty much as she did in this disclosure. What do folks think? Everyone wants to jump in. I guess that's actually, no, that isn't unusual. Okay, so Ellen, defense will clearly say she used makeup to hide alleged bruises, delayed telling her family. Okay, that's definitely going to be one. Thank you, Ellen. Absolutely correct. What would some other folks think? And I know I've got probably a big audience of experienced prosecutors here, so I know folks have some probably thoughts about it already as they listen. No physical evidence. I'm
Can you hear
sorry.
me?
Yes, I can.
The jury's not going to believe her because they don't understand her trauma response. She acted normal afterwards. She didn't tell right away. She showered to hide evidence. She sat down and had dinner. They're not going to understand her behavior, and I'm going to not believe her. So credibility would be a huge issue for the jury.
So yeah, she doesn't fit it another way, and I forgot who gave that answer. I couldn't see. But yeah, the disclosure doesn't fit in maybe the stereotype folks have about how victims respond or react, or how a juror thinks how they would respond or react to being sexually assaulted. No physical evidence. Defense is going to claim consent, but points out if there's a gun recovered, that's going to be a great counter. Turquoise Williams, yes.
Hi, yeah, I was just gonna say that it sounds like other people, that the defense might frame it that other people told her she was raped, that her, whether it be her friend or also the psychologist, that they kind of were the ones who implied that, or outright told her that she was in danger, that she was raped, that they kind of pushed her into saying that.
They put the idea in her head. So
Right.
that's a great point. Thank you. How about other folks? Well, looking at the time tick away, let's sort of shift it. We were talking about the lemons. Let's talk about some way we can make some lemonade here if we're prosecuting this case. So we get that disclosure and we sort of identified some of these challenges. How can we sort of reshift it or reframe it in an offender-focused way? In other words, these challenges that we just recognized, how can we sort of frame it or approach it to frame it as how the suspect or the offender caused these challenges? And if you want to, also allude to what you want to do for follow-up too. Turquoise, you've still got the mic. That's fine.
Oh, okay, great. Well, a couple of things would be, I don't know what time has elapsed, but if she is able, if someone can take pictures of the bruises, if she still has bruises on her, if it's possible to get a forensic, any psychologist to testify to the fact that that behavior is very typical, in terms of how she's responding. And there may still be evidence on her clothes. Just because she washed them does not necessarily mean that there is not still evidence. And same thing with a rape kit. If it's only been 24 hours, there may still be semen inside of her. So,
oh, sorry.
There's potentially still a lot of evidence there.
We got a comment from Megan. I'm a social worker, so I'm guessing here, talk to witnesses, friends who may have seen bruises, any witnesses outside the apartment. So these are all great areas for corroboration that both Turquoise and Megan have mentioned. But these victim behaviors that are challenges, or these behaviors that folks have identified as a challenge, delayed disclosure, the sort of trying to normalize her life almost. Is there any way we can sort of shift that into from a focus of what the victim did to how the offender caused that? Or if you were developing this case at trial, how you might want to reframe that as to how the victim caused that behavior, or strategies you might pursue to reveal that? All right. Well,
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question.
Sure. So we talk about the kinds of problems, and this is really a sort of good entryway into what we're going to be talking about. These kinds of challenges, we talked about how the defense is going to be framing this disclosure with the victim. And they might be framing it as, oh, she's just doing that. She didn't disclose this herself. She's being pressured to by other people. She waited to disclose it. She went and she got a shower. She had dinner. She didn't think she was raped. So sort of twisting that, I mean, that's how the defense is going to be attacking the victim. But, and again, trying to reduce it to, hey, this is just her word against his word. But sort of there's a flip to that, sort of reframing it and from the perspective of, well, gee, these sort of challenges that the defendant brings to the case, are there things the offender did that we can figure it out as to might help explain the context for the victim's behavior? And Latina has a great comment here. The offender threatened to kill her. So that's going to be one reason for the delayed disclosure. He caused that fear. Anonymous attendee, that's not their name. I think they're just anonymous. The fear and intimidation that's created with a with the gun. Megan talked about bringing in a trauma specialist, maybe teach the jury about trauma responses, what they look like in reality. So maybe our jury's not going to be left with an unreasonable doubt. The fear because of the weapon. And these are all great things, but there's a couple other things that we're going to be talking about and thinking about these offenders as well. We know she's pretty young. There's an inference, but not clear. The offender had his own apartment, so maybe the offender was older. So on some level, this victim, Lindsay, was picked, maybe some level, the offender's picking her because he knows she's young, because she's inexperienced, because she's worried about getting in trouble from that. The offender had her trust. He worked with her, knew her for a few weeks. This was something the offender was able to develop, to exploit, to counter with Lindsay, to utilize against her. So a lot of these reactions that Lindsay had that the defense is going to be trying to use against her, these are all things that an offender could have been planning on or plotting on to accomplish the crime. Jennifer was adding here, maybe there was grooming on some level. And that is something maybe the follow-up we want to find out about, not just what happened that day, but what happened in the few weeks before this relationship, how he gained her trust. So instead of just reacting to what the defense is saying about the victim, maybe we're going to be putting the defendant in the spotlight as to how he created or how he identified these kinds of vulnerabilities in a victim. Vanessa points out, I'm a social worker, but I'm thinking he may have planned this. He had the music loud, maybe groomed her to get what she wanted, but these are the other areas. So this is a great approach. And the reason why I'm suggesting this and why it's useful, this sort of vignette, is because it does talk about, hey, look, ultimately, most crimes of sexual violence, they're not going to be perpetrated or recorded on camera or perpetrated in front of a third-party eyewitness. But nevertheless, a sort of framing about a sexual violence case as, gee, the offender's denial and the victim disclosure, that they have to be viewed equally, that they're on an equal scale. And we want to sort of get away by that by taking a deeper dive and sort of appreciating the risk of serial offenders and just how prolific offenders can be, how much planning goes into, and be working our prosecutions and investigations with an eye towards revealing that, to show the big picture. And ultimately, so that we're conducting a prosecution that's not just reacting to attacks against the victim, but hopefully shifting that spotlight to the offender. So, and really, this is the encapsulation of this approach of being victim-centered and offender-focused. And folks may have heard about these phrases and being victim-centered and offender-focused, and maybe just use them casually on some level. And let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into what this terminology or what these terms can mean. Victim-centered can mean a lot of ways, and I don't think it's always been historically the approach of a lot of prosecutors. And when I say historically, I mean 20 or 30 years ago. But being victim-centered on one level, it's an appreciation that victims are going to be more than just talking exhibits of evidence, but really that our victim survivors are going to be central to the criminal justice system. And that as prosecutors and as practitioners in the criminal justice system, is that one level or one duty we have is that victim's safety and privacy and well-being must be paramount throughout the process. And so what we do is we recognize that part of what we want to do and part of our obligation that has to be twinned with our obligation to hold offenders accountable and to make sure that the public safety is promoted, but recognizing that part of our obligation to the victim and that we want to make sure they're safe. We want to try to preserve and protect their privacy. And on some level, we want to try to minimize their re-traumatization as well. What's balanced with that is this idea of an offender-focused approach. And this is something more, when I was a younger prosecutor, it's something I could quickly and easily understand, and maybe an area where a lot of prosecutors are more comfortable operating. But when we take even a deeper appreciation of what offender focus means, it's something more than just getting the bad guy. Being offender focused means taking the challenges or the facts of our case, and essentially that if there's a challenge or an issue in our case that might seem like a lemon, trying to reframe it and understand or appreciate how it might actually be lemonade. And an offender focused approach means that when we take these challenges, we didn't just ask what our victim did, but we take a deeper dive as to how did our offender pick this victim? How they select the victims? What made the offender execute the strategy? How they devise a strategy? And how did our offender develop a plan to get away with it? We want to recognize that there can be a lot of myths about sexual assault that offenders are going to use to avoid credibility, especially in things like alcohol-facilitated sexual assault and things of that nature. We want to keep our focus on the actions, the behaviors, and the characteristics and intent of the offender. So really what our prosecution strategy is, it's not just trying to minimize or explain or excuse these victim challenges that the defense might be bringing to light or attacking the prosecution for, but it's trying to reframe them and flip these challenges onto the offender. So that if there's delayed disclosure, well then, gee, what did the offender do to contribute that? How did they select a victim that would be so vulnerable to delayed disclosure? Let's take a deeper dive into what this means. We've already talked about this approach is really about defining the issues. It's not what the victim did, but it's going to be about what the offender did. And in understanding what the offender did, we're going to need an appreciation about the reality of a lot of perpetrators of sexual violence. Now, the popular conception or stereotype of sexual violence might be a stranger assault, a stranger assaulting someone they don't know, probably with force or an explicit threat of force, probably with a knife or weapon, and probably with the utilization of weapons. And of course, rapes and sexual assault and sexual violence is perpetrated this way, and it can happen this way. But the reality is most offenders are looking for a way to complete their crime that's going to avoid them getting apprehended. So an offender essentially is going to be looking for the least risky way in which they can accomplish or complete a rape or a sexual assault. What's a way that they can perpetrate the crime in a way that either they won't be held accountable or the victim's never going to report or disclose it. And using weapons or explicit force or violence or injuries is going to be a higher risk for method for most offenders to perpetrate sexual violence. Now, those are going to be the ones probably more easily prosecutable by us, but the more experienced offenders, or if you like a video game analogy, the more leveled up offenders who've learned and who've refined their methods of sexual assault are not going to be perpetrating sexual assault that way. Not because there's necessarily any moral bright line, it's just because they're going to be looking for the easiest, least risky way to complete a sexual assault. And that's going to be with a victim who the offender knows. and with a victim who that on some level, the offender has cultivated or groomed trust from that victim, trust that can be exploited. Offenders are going to have multiple victims. Sexual assault and the other reality about sexual violence and rape is, despite a lot of defense attempts to maybe sort of just try to frame a case as an incident that got out of control or beyond, offenders are going to have multiple victims. Rape or sexual assault is not a one and done crime. Oh, I got that out of my system, I'm not going to perpetrate again. But most offenders are going to be having multiple victims. Most offenders are going to be refining their methods or the techniques of gaining access to the victims, perpetrating victims, and escaping accountability for what they do for victims. In our investigations, we want to try to reveal that, recognizing that, of course, more developed offenders are going to be targeting victims. So maybe we're just going to be reducing the case to a victim said, offender said. But offenders are going to have a lot of experience going into with this particular victim. And when we combine that with the fact that most victims don't disclose or report to law enforcement, for the victims that do, we want to have an appreciation that this offender probably has lots of victims in their past that never disclosed or never came forward. The analogy, I referenced it earlier, is the idea that offenders, when they perpetrate, it's almost like a video game. They're leveling up, they're gaining an experience and skills in committing sexual assault, sexual violence. That's going to make them more subtle. It's going to make them more nuanced. For some of them, it might make them more reckless too. But we want to identify those tactics. And that's, speaking of tactics, we want to recognize that when offenders commit crimes, like Lindsay's perpetrator did, they had a plan. They employed tactics. It's not something that spontaneously developed or spontaneously came about. But they had an idea about, at some point, how am I going to commit sexual assault? How am I going to commit sexual assault about this victim? Who's the victim I'm selecting? How am I going to get them alone? How am I going to select them? And those are the things that we want our prosecution and hopefully, ideally, our investigation to be able to reveal and show the fact finder, so that this credibility contest, so-called, can be weighed appropriately. Now, identifying predatory behavior. How do offenders do that? Well, first, as we mentioned, defendant's going to have an intent to commit this crime with a victim. And this intent to commit a crime can be broad, but then the next thing is to select a victim. And this victim, I saw one comment from Vicky, the offender might be targeting victims who appear insecure or a victim with self-esteem issues because they may blame herself even when it's not her fault. And that's a great point. But an offender is going to be selecting a victim who they think they can get, that they can commit against or perpetrate against and get away with it. That victim might have some sort of vulnerability, a vulnerability that's either real or perceived by the offender. Maybe this victim is going to be from a more marginalized population or community, such that, hey, the defendant knows on some level, if this victim disclosed, this victim's a sex worker, this victim is an addict, this victim is from the wrong side of town. The offender knows that this victim isn't going to be disbelieved, that this victim is going to be dismissed. On the other hand, too, the offender might recognize, hey, look, this victim is vulnerable. They don't have any support. That's what's going to make this such a great or vulnerable victim. Maybe this victim's going to be undocumented and be scared to go to authorities. Maybe the victim's going to be scared to participate in the criminal justice system for other reasons that are rational or otherwise. But these are things that an offender is going to be calculating in who they attack and who they victimized. Then once of its type of, maybe and more commonly, and we talk about these sort of vulnerabilities, the victim might be vulnerable because of intoxication or because they're voluntary intoxicated. These are vulnerabilities which an offender can develop and exploit in ways that are going to be a lot more subtle and a lot less risky for the offender than an offender just using force or explicit force or weapon or something like that. Once this vulnerability is identified, either consciously or intuitively by an offender is going to have some sort of plan. They're going to have some sort of strategy. They're going to be manipulating that victim on some level, either to get them alone, to get them isolated for when they're vulnerable. And then once those are accomplished, the sexual assault is going to be perpetrated, and the offender is going to have some strategy to get away with it. In other words, to cover it up. This might be something explicit as telling the victim, don't tell anyone this, no one's going to believe you. It might be harassing the victim. It might just be shocking the victim, especially if the victim has this sort of insecurities that was mentioned earlier, or the offender had such a high level of trust with the victim that the victim is just in disbelief about what happened, or shell-shocked, essentially. So ultimately, the model in which we're going to be using, because this targeting of victims is going to be critical for how we can exploit and sort of reveal this offender-focused strategy and shift the spotlight from the victim to the offender, is identifying how the offenders target victims. And it's really 3 different areas. And I sort of referenced it, and this is just talking about it in a different way. But an offender's got to have accessibility to victims. In this sense, the victim's got to be somewhere where they can find victims, where they can meet victims, where they can locate victims. Alcohol facilitated sexual assault probably gives the clearest and most common example we're doing with this. To get access to victims, an offender who's using alcohol to perpetrate sexual assault is going to go to where people are drinking, where people get intoxicated. An offender who perpetrates drug-facilitated sexual assaults, in other words, surreptitiously or secretly giving people so-called date rape drugs, is probably going to go to where people are drinking, because those usually aren't going to be administered in the line at CVS or at the grocery store. It's going to be administered in an environment where people are already letting their hair down, feeling comfortable and secure, where an offender can do that. An offender is going to be somewhere where they can access the victim, but they're also going to be looking to develop, exploit vulnerabilities of a victim. Maybe it's a physical or intellectual disability. Maybe it's these other areas we talked about. And they're also going to be trying to look for victims who will be disbelieved or whose disclosures will be minimized when this happens. Maybe this is going to be an offender using their high status or stature compared to the lesser stature or status from the victim to make accusations and disclosures uncomfortable for the rest of us. But these are things that offenders are going to be developing and utilizing. And the more experienced, the more sophisticated offenders are going to be using lots of these approaches simultaneously with one another. Again, the idea of sexual assault and where more sexual assault and rape is going to be happening is going to be perpetrated in this area where offenders are going to be using non-traditional, and probably a better way to say non-traditional is probably non-stereotypical weapons and tactics. Most sexual assault or sexual violence isn't going to be perpetrated with weapons or explicit force, although that will happen, and maybe that's an element even in our sexual assault. But of a lot of offenders might be using, again, most commonly, alcohol-facilitated sexual assaults. Offenders are going to be trying to get our victims isolated, so they're not in an environment or a location where there's support for the victim. So when we're developing our cases, when we're developing our prosecutions, are we looking for how did the offender get the victim alone? How did the offender get the victim away from friends that were with the victim? How did the offender over time keep the victim from maybe a social network or support network that would help the victim? How can we bring our evidence and our testimony to reveal that offender's effort at isolation? Because usually most of these non-traditional or non-stereotypical weapons and tactics, it'll rarely, if ever, be explicitly stated by an offender. What our job is as prosecutors is to find the other evidence that's going to let the fact finder see circumstantially or draw the inference that this is what the offender was doing. Because most offenders aren't going to say this part out loud. Because why? Because they're going to be more sophisticated than that. The manipulation of the victim, of course, deceiving the victim, which is what's going to be happening usually with a lot of pre-existing relationships that are exploited by an offender. and also intimidation and coercion. Now, of course, this intimidation and coercion can be an explicit, like, oh, gee, if you tell this, this is the violent thing that'll happen to you. But more commonly, this intimidation and coercion is exercised by sexual violence perpetrators is going to be more subtle. It's going to be, look what's going to happen to you if discloses it. Look at what's going to happen to your reputation. Look at what people are going to think of you if you talk about what happened. Coercion too, especially if we have an inexperienced victim, don't want to forget about image exploitation and utilizing those areas. So recognizing this, and we talked about a little bit or addressed that disclosure is the exception, not the rule, and that offenders, when they perpetrate, they're going to be perpetrating in circumstances where it's going to be a hard case. It's going to be a challenging case. This isn't a controlled drug delivery type of prosecution. But in bringing these cases forward and developing it, even when it's framed as just a credibility contest, we want to have an appreciation of the dangerousness. Now, of course, whatever standard we use for charging these crimes that we do for other cases, whether it's a reasonable likelihood of conviction at trial, if the jury follows the evidence in the law, whether it's probable cause, whatever standard we use in sexual violence cases, which is hopefully the same standard we're using in robbery, burglary, or drug delivery cases, one aspect we want to recognize is the dangerousness to the offender. Of course, suspects, sexual violence suspects known to the victim or unknown to the victim present a lot of danger. But what we also want to be thinking of too is the idea of serial offenders and crossover offenders. The idea that when we get this disclosure from a victim, that it's going to be against an offender who likely has other victims who never came forward, and an offender who's going to be likely to re-perpetrate either with this crime or, as a lot of these untested rape kit studies have revealed, be perpetrating other crimes. Again, someone who commits sexual violence, it's not a one and done thing, but they're likely going to be perpetrating and committing other crimes and also other sexual violence crimes against other victims. So a lot of the credibility contest type case is going to be dependent on some level, not always, but often, on the consent defense. And this is going to be one, either attacking the credibility or just reducing it to this idea of a credibility wash. Like, how can we be sure beyond a reasonable doubt the offender's version or the victim's version? Let's call it a wash, and that sort of clarion call to the jury. But again, that sort of reduction of the disclosure versus the denial doesn't really fit with a lot of common sense or motivations that most of our credibility instructions and jury instructions tell the jury to consider. Because for most victims to disclose, and for most victims certainly to go through the criminal justice process, they're not gaining anything. Their life doesn't get better. In point of fact, their life gets harder. Whereas obviously most offenders have a self-interested motivation to reduce a sexual assault or rape to something of consent or something like that. So even if we just have an offender's version and a victim's version, with all else being equal, there's more reason to sort of distrust the offender's denial than the victim's disclosure. And part of the reason what makes it so hard for victims to come forward is, of course, the character attacks that they're going to be suffering. The second guessing that a victim's going to be doing for their action. Why did I let myself be alone with this person? Why did I drink so much? Why did I put my trust in someone who would end up doing this? Those things that the victim is going to be attacking themselves for, certainly the defense is probably going to attack them for. So with blackout and pass out, we're going to save that and talk about that a little bit down the line here. But also the other reality is just going to be a consent defense. And this is going to be a lot of the defense effort to try to frame a sexual violence disclosure as just an incident or an event that got out of hand and could have happened to anyone. And of course, we want to help the jury appreciate that, look, sexual offenders aren't living under every rock, or sexual violence offenses aren't living under every rock, that this presents a unique violation of the victim's autonomy as well as public safety. So when we get a consent to focus, talking about ways we can take it and reframe that consent with an offender focus. So delayed disclosure, of course, the defense is going to be talking about the delayed disclosure shows the incredibility that it was non-consensual. But again, taking our evidence and emphasizing that the offenders, how the offender's selection of this victim lent itself to a delayed disclosure. The method of perpetuation of the offense, gaining the victim's trust and then shocking them with a sexual assault. Maybe using alcohol in which to commit the sexual assault and facilitate the sexual assault are going to be things that contribute the delayed disclosure. Things the defendant chose to do that lend itself or contributed to this delayed disclosure from the victim are things we want to bring up, reframing that victim focus and changing it to an offender focus. A prior relationship, of course, that exploitation of trust that's perpetrated by an offender, and also voluntary intoxication, which we're going to address a little bit more. But legally speaking, too, we want to recognize that a lot of times our codes are going to be putting a lot of limitations on a consent defense. And if that isn't clearly and explicitly highlighted in our jury instructions, we want to make sure our courts are doing so. Now, because this is a national audience, I'm drawing from the model penal code, but I really recommend checking your own sexual violence statutes. And if it's not in your sexual violence statutes, check those beginning chapters in your criminal code or criminal title that's going to be talking about consent as a defense and talking about ways it might be more limited than suggested by the defense. First of all, the model penal code and many other jurisdictions are going to be talking about consent is ineffective if given by a person too intoxicated to be able to make a reasonable judgment. And I know some folks are here from jurisdictions that already have great statutes for alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. Some of you probably are dealing with statutes that are more challenging. But look in your jurisdiction for that consent as a defense. And if it talks about, hey, look, you can't use a consent as a defense when the victim is too obviously intoxicated. So then we can just building up our investigation to show the obvious nature of our victim's intoxication. A lot of times our offenders are going to be giving statements about how drunk the victim was because they think it reduces their credibility or believability. We also want to note this line too, or point in the model penal code, assent doesn't constitute consent if it's induced by force, duress, or deception. Now, obviously the force or duress case, we already know how to build our prosecutions with that. But we also want to be taking a deep dive into what sort of deception about what the defendant might have been manipulating. Deception about getting the victim alone, getting the victim vulnerable, getting access to the victim, things the offender was doing in those areas that might negate or give our jury a chance to negate a defense argument. If you have the evidence that supports it, in other words, evidence of extreme intoxication or evidence of force, duress, or deception, we want to make sure that the jury's instructed on that point of law, that it's not just something we're arguing about, but hey, look, under the law, there's no consent defense if there's an intoxicated victim, if assent is induced by force, duress, or deception. And we want to be hitting that home in closing argument as well. So we already hit on that, but investigation, how do we work with our folks and friends in law enforcement to be building up our investigation? And look, there's no simple answer to doing so other than it's a kitchen sink type of effort. It's something deeper than just interviewing our victim once and maybe getting a statement from the offender, but it's a lot more holistic effort. And one of the things I make it similar to is the same sort of effort we would probably produce in a homicide investigation or a homicide or murder case. Ideally wants to be our same mentality when we're pursuing a sexual violence case, especially when we anticipate that there's going to be essentially a credibility contest or there's a risk of it being reduced into a credibility contest. And this is, of course, beginning with the recognition that the foundation of our investigation is going to be starting with the victim interview and talking about trauma-informed practices to conduct that victim interview, but ultimately recognizing the limitations of a victim and their ability to disclose, especially after being traumatized, and looking for other ways to corroborate their statement and to build it. So let's talk about some of these efforts, beginning with disclosure from a victim. and how to receive a disclosure and talk with the victim about their disclosure of sexual assault in a trauma-informed way. Well, let's start with a couple premises that begin this, and that when a victim discloses, as we've referenced, it's going to be the exception, not the rule. Doing so is going to be difficult. Most of the time, a victim will never report to law enforcement, which means most offenders and perpetrators of sexual violence are going to get away with it. And the other reality about a disclosure is that it's not a one and done event. It can be a process. It can be a process for a variety of reasons. Some of it might be just because of a shock and the traumatization a victim suffers. It takes them a while for them to disclose and appreciate and catalog what happened. Other times, especially if our offender selected a victim who's from a marginalized or from a community that maybe doesn't trust the criminal justice system, it can be a while before we gain the victim's trust and before we've earned the victim's trust. But when we get a disclosure from a victim, or when a victim is trying to give us a disclosure, we want to be recognizing the barriers that victims face. Some of those are going to be systematic, some of them are going to be offender created, but all these kinds of barriers are going to be impacting victims' ability to participate. So as much as we can, and this is where that victim-centered component lands, we want to be looking for ways in which our victims can be supported. And this is why multidisciplinary collaboration with victim witness advocates, both system-based and community-based, is so critical. Because only by working with both those types and sources of advocacy together can we really sort of maximize our ability to get victim support. And from an offender-focused perspective, the more supported victims are, the better they're going to be able to disclose, the better they're going to be able to participate in a prosecution. From a victim-centered perspective, doing that and finding support for victims and recognizing our obligation isn't just as a trial lawyer, but actually there to help victims, the more we're going to be doing right by them and doing justice, and justice in the broadest sense. So trauma-informed interviewing. Now, listen, we have entire presentations that are 90 minutes in of themselves talking about trauma-informed interviewing practices and approaches. So I'm certainly not going to be able to capture all of it in this presentation. And a lot of those are cataloged on our YouTube channel, which I recommend folks check out when you have the time. But some fundamentals of a trauma-informed approach is that it's not a formula, that there is no one universal trauma-informed approach. Because really what a trauma-informed approach means it's meeting and interacting with victims and listening to victims in ways that are unique to each victim, with their history, their environment, and the nature of the assault which they experienced. So it really, trauma-informed approaches, it's not about figuring out ways that the victims are going to be adapting themselves to us, or having a checklist that we demand a victim conform to, but it's more of us trying to learn how to adapt to what the victim's needs are, even if it might be something unconventional, even if it doesn't fit within our protocol, figuring out how to understand a victim and then adapt ourselves to the victim. But part of it, some fundamentals, especially for our prosecutors, is when we're meeting with our victims, we want to have a witness with us. Whether that might be a system-based community advocate, whether that's law enforcement. We're not coaching victims what to disclose or say, but we're listening for it. We're also not going to be judging victims. We're going to be recognizing that one of the things offenders do is they put victims in a vulnerable position where they might have to share some embarrassing or awkward details and circumstances about their life generally and about the assault specifically. And so we want to let victims know that, look, we're not here to judge them, and let them know from that beginning, and have an appreciation that, especially when we as prosecutors are talking to victims, especially maybe in circumstances where they're meeting us in our office, they had to go through the medical detector, they had to go through the waiting room where we have the always inviting bulletproof glass. Then when we come and meet them, we're probably in professional clothing or something like that, a suit and power tie or what have you. We're bringing our victim in through a busy office. If it's like most DA's offices, is going to be hectic. That can be intimidating, and that can set up an unbalanced power dynamic. And we want to try to mitigate or compensate against that in as many ways as possible. but also with an interview that our first goal is to ascertain the truth, to learn what happened as much as the victim is able to disclose, but no more than the victim's able to disclose. And secondary to that is, of course, going to be building our case. Some other principles, and this might be ring familiar with folks who have familiarity with forensic interviewing of children. One of the approaches with the trauma-informed interviewing is building or establishing rapport and taking the time to do that. And I don't have a specific about the appropriate time we want to establish rapport, but it should be something more than is just pro forma. And there's a couple reasons why we want to take time to establish rapport with victims. And by establishing rapport, I mean getting to know them a little bit as people, understanding some context of their lives outside of this case. One, it can be a great way to sort of just level and make people comfortable. And that's certainly a victim-centered reason for doing it. But the other reason for taking some time to establish rapport when we're meeting victims is because that's going to give us a tool or a measure or a standard in which to understand how the victim communicates. So when we're listening to the victim, when we're seeing, checking the abilities victim to correct our understanding, seeing what kind of terminology or concepts that they can understand, how they're comfortable communicating, and things like that. That rapport session that we have with victims is going to be a great baseline for us to utilize. On some level, hopefully we can have some sort of component of rapport even in our jury selection, or even in our trial, I should say, where we ask the victim a little bit about who they are, where they're from, a little bit about their background. So the jury has that sort of baseline in understanding how the victim just talks about things when it's not about an incident of rape. Throughout the trauma-informed interview, we want to protect against victim blaming. Meaning when we're protecting against victim blaming, we don't want to be adversarial with the victim. We don't want to make the victim second guess themselves. Now, a very reasonable question you might have is, well, wait, Curlin, if we want to protect against victim blaming, as prosecutors, we still have to ask some really challenging questions so that we can do our job as prosecutors. We need to know how intoxicated that victim might have been. We might need to know whether or not they were participating as a sex worker, whether or not they were doing drugs. We might have to ask about a lot of challenging areas that if we don't ask about, the defense is going to be asking about. And that's conceded. But really, when we're asking about these areas that are challenges and when we're exploring these areas with the victim, I think what's going to be important to do to protect against victim blaming is that we talk to the victim about why we need to ask about these areas, why we're exploring these areas. If we're asking the victim about what they were wearing, we're asking this question not to necessarily slut shame them, but to see if there's physical evidence of the clothes on the scene, to see if we can identify them in video, to see if that's going to be corroborated in a defendant statement, or just to get that on the record. And that's, we want to let the victim know as much as possible why we're asking questions. I think as much as possible, we don't want to keep, we're not a McDonald's where there's a secret recipe or secret sauce. One strategy, though, that can help us sort of frame these challenging areas is if we frame them with this magic word called able. And framing our questions in this way can help us avoid accusations against the victim along the lines of, why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? Or even reframing the judgmental or questions that can sound judgmental, even if they're not intended to be judgmental as us, such as what you were wearing or how much did you drink? When we use this kind of word or framing of our questions in direct examination at trial, it can help communicate to our fact finder, to our jury, that the victim may not be able to remember or recall certain details. So here's an illustration of that. What are you able to tell me? It's going to be acknowledging and implicitly conveying understanding of trauma. It's also going to be giving a victim space for saying, I don't remember, or gee, I'm not a bad student if I can't answer. Tells the victim, hey, look, we understand there's limitations in what you're able to tell and what you're able to disclose. When we're meeting with victims, of course, we want to be expecting inconsistencies. This is a reality because, of course, our victims are human beings. They're not going to be surveillance cameras. These inconsistencies can result from a variety of reasons, such as trauma, May also be from the way questions are asked, especially they're asked by people from different practices, different disciplines. The way a nurse might ask a question versus a law enforcement versus a prosecutor might be a little bit different. Of course, there may be a victim who fears to disclose certain details out of either protecting someone or trying to protect themselves. And also the reality, of course, that as the trauma is processed, the nature of disclosure might necessarily require it to be disclosed in layers. So when we do get a disclosure, of course, we want to recognize our Brady obligation, our obligation to disclose that to the defense, any evidence that's favorable. But if there's inconsistencies that really isn't material, we want to be able to analyze that and maybe make motions about how this inconsistency shouldn't be brought out because it isn't material. Or if it is brought out at trial, another strategy can be like, oh, look how desperate the defense is for harping on inconsistencies that don't really matter. It's because it's a distraction. So the big point about disclosure, it's a foundation of our sexual assault prosecution, but it's not a be all and end all. It's a foundation. And really what we're looking for from our victim's disclosure is ways that we can pursue in our investigation and bring to light corroboration of whatever the victim's able to disclose it. And this begins, of course, with the premise that just because no one saw the assault, which most often people don't, doesn't mean there aren't any witnesses. So when we're asking the victim about what happened before, what happened during, and what happened after the sexual assault, we're looking for additional witnesses. We're looking for those witnesses that can corroborate what happened both before the incident and in the moments and days and weeks after the incident. Prior to the incident, who can corroborate the locations involved, the transactions involved, the restaurant bills, whatever occurred, interaction the victim may have had with the offender, the level of intoxication of the victim. These are the kinds of corroboration witnesses we're looking to find out and then hopefully connect with and get interviewed. In the days after the incident, who can talk about the victim's demeanor, the victim's disclosure, maybe harassment that they received from either the defendant or the defendant's network. Other kinds of corroboration the victim might help us understand is transportation methods, how they got from maybe where they met the defendant to where the assault control occurred, maybe areas that might be subject to surveillance video. Of course, a really sort of gold standard, especially more modern prosecutions, are in our victim's disclosure or from our victim's disclosure. Is there any sort of indicators about digital evidence being utilized? Is there indications that the defendant sent a text about when to meet or afterwards? Are there screenshots? Were they at a party where photographs were being taken or location where photographs were being taken? As a prosecutor on one level, we're thinking, so when we get this information, is there going to be evidence of probable cause to seize and ultimately search the defendant's device? So if our victim discloses that there are text messages, we want to get screenshots of that. Ideally, if we can keep from doing so, we don't want to seize the victim's device because we want to be protecting their privacy. But then to corroborate this disclosure of the screenshots, is there an opportunity to then also seize the defendant's device and find out if there's corroboration about text being sent? Maybe text being deleted from the defendant's device might give us a probable cause. Maybe our victim is going to be describing the type of device the offender uses. And when ultimately we lawfully are able to seize or and search a defendant's device, is there an opportunity where we're going to be in a lawful vantage point to maybe find out other communications an offender had about the assault and or about the victim? And these are things that we want to be building. The victim's disclosure is the beginning of our investigation, not the end of our investigation. Of course, in the reality of sexual assault investigations, intimidation is going to be a reality, especially because most offenders are going to have some sort of pre-existing relationship with the victim, with some kind of pre-existing relationship, be it intimate partner or just an acquaintance. There's going to be connections to the victim, and where there's connections, there's greater opportunity for intimidation. We want to prepare the victim for it. And we want to prepare the victim for it in the sense that not only it's going to happen, but it might take more sort of subtle forms than just explicit force or violence. It may be guilting the victim, like, oh gosh, if you go through with this, what's going to happen to my future? You're going to cause me to go to jail. What's going to happen? That's intimidation. That's trying to manipulate a victim so they won't participate in the system. And we want to be able to get that preserved and bring that out. If an offender apologizes, of course, that's going to be equivalent to a confession. When we do get a report of intimidation, we want to be prepared to obtain corroboration of it, whether through whatever method might be available, as well as follow up with appropriate bail and bond motions and new charges. Now, evidence of offender's intent, we can be looking for that through a variety of ways. But one of the ways is we want to be looking for who was in control, who made the decisions about what happened, who controlled the momentum or the direction of the encounter, both before and subsequent to the sexual assault. But the other thing we want to do beyond showing the evidence of the offender's intent is hopefully do some sort of investigation that can show the history of the offender. This history of the offender might be a history with this particular victim, or it might be a history with multiple victims. With respect to history of conduct pertaining to this particular victim, in other words, we want to get a history of grooming behavior or acclimating the offender, the offender's acclimating the victim to the offender's behavior, and especially if there's an intimate partner sexual assault or spousal rape. One of the things we want to be using is our stalking elements. And the reason why is because there's a history of conduct perpetrated by an offender against our victim designed to cause fear of bodily injury or cause a serious emotional distress. That sort of history or course of conduct helps inform us about the offender's intent, pattern, and access to the victim in our sexual assault. So when there's that pre-existing relationship between the offender and our victim, we want to be looking at our stalking charge because one, it's going to be a great sort of umbrella way to be bringing in that history of maybe grooming behavior or prior criminal activity perpetrated by our victim against perpetrated by our offender against a victim, showing that constant continuity of purpose. For example, a lot of human trafficking cases, if you're prosecuting the trafficker, there's going to be a rape case involved in a rape charge involved with that because there's going to be sexual violence perpetrated by the trafficker against the victim. Stalking is going to be a great device to show the history of criminal activity perpetrated by that offender against this victim. And if you have an intimate partner sexual relationship, as we're going to address later on, that's also going to be a great device to bring in the whole. Stalking is going to be a great tool to bring in the whole history of domestic violence in addition to the sexual assault and give context to that. Of course, we also want to be investigating other bad acts with our 404B rule. How do we find these other bad acts? How do we find these other victims? Well, some of the methods, of course, we want to be exploring the defendant's reputation, which means talking to their friends and family and network, but also looking through the offender's social media history, maybe finding out people the offender was in former relationships, the acquaintances, education and employment records. A lot of times prior disciplinary actions might have been minimized on record as just a dismissal or a reprimand. When we unpack the context, it might have actually been some sort of episode of sexual violence that was just reduced to that. And of course, there might be additional CODIS hits. And when we do have a reporting such that there could be a sample taken in our case, if it's prompt enough, we always want to get it tested, even if it was, even if it's a consent case. And the reason why, even if there's a consent offense, testing our sexual assault kits is still going to be critical because it can still help corroborate our victim's disclosure. The defendant might have minimized the level of physical contact, and that might be able to be impeached by the DNA finding or the DNA tests. And the other fact is too, that even if a defendant says in a police interview that there was contact, but it was consensual, the defendant isn't obligated to pursue that defense at trial. The defendant might just say, well, look, I said there was contact because I was scared by the police, but there wasn't any. And of course, it doesn't look great at that point if we never got the kit tested. But perhaps the best reason, though, not the best reason, another great reason to get kits tested is to get that defendant, that known defendant's profile uploaded into CODIS and seeing if there might be another case or other victims that match the defendant's DNA that might be appropriate for 404B evidence. So one question I've seen developed is people are asking if this is going to be recorded and available to review. And the answer is yes. This is going to be archived on our YouTube channel. We'll also be able to administer copies of the PowerPoint later. Thank you for asking on that point. So an offender interview, now I'm not going to get too deeply into this because attached to this presentation, I have copies of sort of suggested areas you might want to be interviewing an offender about or cross-examining an offender about. And so I'm not going to go through them bullet by bullet. But ultimately, it's talking about an offender interview or strategy. It's not so much of a gotcha or Perry Mason confession moment that you're going to obtain from the offender. But you're just seeing what sort of specifics of the victim's disclosure can be corroborated by an offender's account, and then finding out and looking for evidence of how the victim got control or how the offender got control. And those are the sort of strategies we might want to be building off our interview with. Now, I want to take a little bit of time, about 10 minutes or so, talking about alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. Again, this is a topic where we can take a much deeper dive, about 90 minutes. But we do want to address it because, of course, alcohol is such a commonly utilized tool by sexual offenders. And the reason why is because alcohol is a successful way for an offenders to facilitate sexual assault. And it sort of helps reduce sexual contest prosecutions into inappropriate credibility contests. And the reason why this works for offenders is a lot of impressions. A victim drinking means they're more to blame. An offender drinking means there's less blame. Problem is that this doesn't recognize the impact and effect of intoxication. And so really what we want to be doing on alcohol-facilitated sexual assault cases is looking for strategies to prove the victim's level of intoxication at trial. And the reason why is part of that premise in the law is that someone who is too intoxicated can't legally consent. And so the more we're able to demonstrate and prove the victim's level of intoxication through whatever evidence is available, not just the victim, but not just the victim, the better we're going to be able to prove our case of non-consent. One of the strategies, and I, like most prosecutors, cut my teeth on DWI or DUI cases early in my career, and that gives us a lot of strategy we need to prove when people are intoxicated and the impacts of intoxication and the inability to sort of participate or make judgments in your environment. And a lot of those strategies lend themselves to alcohol-facilitated sexual assault prosecutions. Identifying from the evidence about when the victim drank, how much they drank, whether they ate, over what period of time. And in combination, sometimes with the toxicologist, even when there's not a lab test showing the level of intoxication, being able to use through other evidence showing the level of intoxication. What's the kind of evidence we have that can show extreme intoxication? Evidence the victim had to be assisted with physical tasks. Maybe the victim was or was not able to work the phone or work the door to a residence or a security entry code to a residence. Maybe the victim wasn't able to undress themselves. Maybe our victim wasn't even able to walk, and the accused or someone else had to carry the victims. There's video and pictures or people who remember the victim's appearance. That might help establish the level of intoxication. As well as some of the sexual acts and position that was engaged with. Because as we're going to be talking about, the reality of alcohol is that it's a depressant. And most people, when they drink, while at the earliest levels of intoxication, it reduces your inhibitions. At more severe levels of intoxication or more increased levels of intoxication, acting as a depressant is sort of like being under anesthesia. And most people aren't sort of psyched or motivated for sexual activity at higher levels of intoxication. We might want to be utilizing a toxicologist. If we do, we want to have a specific reason for doing so. Maybe to help educate the jury about drug-facilitated sexual assaults. In other words, the kind of symptomology that can corroborate the presence of a drug used for drug-facilitated sexual assault. But even if our defense is the one calling a toxicologist, there's a lot of things we can do on cross-examination that's going to be helpful for our prosecution. Because what this toxicologist can establish, even one called by the defense, is very simply, is that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. What that means is a central nervous system depressant is that alcohol is not an hallucinogen. In other words, the things you remember when you drink usually aren't going to be imagined. You might not remember as much when you're intoxicated, but the things that you do remember aren't made up and not imagined, which is going to be critical, where if you may have a victim with either piecemeal or blocked memory because of intoxication, but they remember saying no, nothing about being intoxicated makes that memory of saying no unreliable or incredible. The other thing a toxicologist can establish is that it disproportionately affects biological women. In other words, a biological woman, generally speaking, is going to absorb alcohol more rapidly than a biological male for drinking the same amount of alcohol. I'm not going to take a deep dive into the reasons why, but this can be especially helpful, and I'd be happy to develop this further if it's an issue in your case. But this can be critical, especially when you have an offender with the "but I was drunk too" type defense. Other thing that's going to be important is that there's visible manifestations of intoxication as one becomes more intoxicated. Other thing toxicologists can establish, even if you're just working with the defense, that startling events don't make you sober. In other words, a trauma of being sexually assaulted doesn't sober you up right away. Only time can remove alcohol from the human body, which is a great way to counter expectations that if you're sexually assaulted, you would automatically be able to resist or scream or stop it some way. And that's not the reality of how toxicology works. So moving on, I do want to address very quickly about drug-facilitated sexual assaults. The best thing to do is listen to our victims. We don't want to rely on drug tests or screen tests to find the presence of a drug that's utilized in drug-facilitated sexual assault. The reason for this is a couple of reasons. One, there's a large variety and multitude of drugs that can be utilized in drug-facilitated assaults, usually about 150 or so. And there's not a universal screen or test used to detect them. So in other words, for you to test accurately for a drug-facilitated sexual assault, you have to know exactly which drug was being used, which can be one of hundreds, and you have to have that exact test available. Compounding this is that most drugs used in drugs-facilitated sexual assaults are processed through the body quickly. They don't last as long as alcohol. So even when you have evidence of it, you might get a negative result because of that. And another complication, of course, is that the threshold for a positive result on a drug screen, it's different from commercial test to commercial test. So in other words, there's not a universal test for what constitutes positive versus what constitutes negative, which is a lot of reasons why we don't want to rely on screens to make our decision about whether or not a drug-facilitated sexual assault can be prosecuted. But we want to be listening to our victims about how they felt, why they think they might have been subject to a drug-facilitated sexual assault. And usually it's going to be marked, well, I've drank before, but this is a lot different than other occasions when I drank. I felt this, I felt that. Maybe your toxicologist can then associate that with the types of substances that can cause those reactions. Also want to address blackouts versus passouts before we talk a little bit about intimate partner sexual violence. Blackouts, of course, related to alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. This has to deal with periods of memory loss. In other words, you're still conscious when you're suffering a blackout, but you're not able to form or shape memories. And of course, how the defense utilizes blackouts is the idea, well, the victim can't remember, but they consented to sexual activity. This is a challenging defense. I'm not trying to minimize it, but there are strategies to push back against that, especially if you have an understanding about how blackouts happen. A blackout isn't predicted only by a high blood alcohol content. In other words, what blackouts have been associated with is if there's a rapid rise of blood alcohol, such as a rapid succession of shots, this is more likely to correlate with a blackout happening. But the thing is, though, even if you're not forming memories of the time you're blacked out, even if you're conscious, you're still exhibiting visible signs of intoxication for whatever you would normally at that BAC. In other words, a 0.15 BAC when you're in a blackout doesn't display or demonstrate any fewer signs of intoxication than a 0.15 BAC when you're not blacked out. And of course, an offender is trying to say, well, you consented to sexual activity, but at the same time, you're falling down drunk, you can't stand up, you're dropping your phone, you're throwing up. Then you really, again, you can't use consent from someone who's intoxicated or rely on consent from someone who's visibly intoxicated. And pass outs are a bit different. That's going to be unconsciousness, similar to sedation to a central nervous system depressant. But really what's critical here, if the victim remembers or thinks they were passed out, the victim says they were blacked out, the evidence that is really connected, being more suggestive of a pass out, is if the victim can also report being in a groggy sort of just hungover state for 24 hours, similarly to when you wake up for surgery. That's going to be consistent with a pass out rather than a blackout. And of course, if there's evidence that a defendant might have concocted or manufactured a blackout defense, that kind of cover up is really good for consciousness of guilt. So I want to touch upon briefly intimate partner sexual violence, recognizing like intimate partner violence, generally intimate partner sexual violence is going to be underreported, but it's going to be having the same sort of dynamics that's going to exist in our DV cases. And that reality is that intimate partners know their victims better than anyone else. And so they know how to access their victims and they know how to make them vulnerable. Really, the sine qua non, or what we really need to bring forth and prosecute our intimate partner sexual assault, is going to be that history of the relationship. Because a lot of times when intimate partner sexual assault is going to be happening, it's going to be happening in the context of a dynamic of sexual violence. So we want to be able to bring out or bring to light past abuse, other acts of violence or power of control in our case, so that even if the act of intimate partner sexual assault we're prosecuting, even if there wasn't any overt or explicit force or threat of force or lack of consent in that instance, the past abuse or the other acts can help inform the context and help show the sort of implicit threat or fear of violence that the victim felt if they said no. And again, this is why we want to be using stalking as a charging tool to help bring in all these charges. So strategies to recreate the crime at trial, looking at our home stretch here, we're in our 8 minutes. Of course, we want to be litigious with our pretrial motions, and these can be focused in various ways. One is protecting the victim. We want to be proactive using our rape shield motions, and most jurisdictions are going to require a defense notice to pierce the rape shield. Your judges might be different, but most courts I've experienced might be forgiving even if defense doesn't comply with the notice requirements for rape shield. So if you don't get that notice, it might be proactive to sort of put the defense in the spot and say, hey, look, I didn't get any notice of you trying to pierce rape shield. Therefore, you agree at trial, you can't bring in any other sexual history, reputation, or evidence relating to my victim. You agree to that, right? And get that question in front of the judge. If there's irrelevant areas about your victim's background or history that are just going to be designed to embarrass the victim, motions to maybe prevent or exclude that. Of course, offender-focused motions, and this is important to do even if it's obvious it's coming in, but maybe even making motions to make sure they come in so the defense can start appreciating the strength of your case. If you're bringing in 404B evidence, motions to litigate that beforehand, that can also serve as a proxy for notice to the defense about your notice to do that. But also everything you're going to be framing as either evidence of flight or cover up to show that consciousness of guilt and that you're asking for that consciousness of guilt instruction. Also, motions to protect victims' privacy and identity as much as possible, especially with cell phones or social media. If there's going to be social media history or cell phone history of the victim that isn't relevant, but is just going to be used to highlight, maybe finding a motion ahead of time to prevent that being disclosed to the jury. And maybe it's stuff that didn't come up in our investigation, but that our offender is familiar with, trying to prevent that, head that off at the pass beforehand through the use of protective orders or pretrial motions. But ultimately, our trial strategy is we want to be exploring these themes, and we want to be keeping our focus on the offender. We want to be looking for methods and strategies to corroborate the disclosure of our victim's testimony. And this is going to be through the old hearsay rules and exceptions that are going to be applying. But especially I want to highlight on recorded recollection. And ideally, if we've memorialized our victim's past statements through video recording and audio recording, then those circumstances where the victim maybe at trial doesn't remember something she testified or disclosed in a prior recording, we might be able to bring that up as a recorded recollection that our jury can consider as substantive evidence. If it's on video, then hopefully our jury can get an appreciation of what our victim's demeanor was like at a time closer to disclosure, if that's helpful. So I do want to get on jury selection, and I do want to note that one of the appendix to the handout that'll be available to you, or to this PowerPoint slides, are samples of jury selection questions, which I'm not going to explore here. But ultimately, these issues that are challenges, we want to start working on or addressing in jury selection. Of course, as prosecutors, I'm not going to be talking about sort of building trust or establishing leadership, but jury selection is really a great opportunity to do that. But we also want to start exploring the issues in the case. And we maybe want to use experience-based questions to introduce the evidence of trauma. And there's a lot deeper ways to do this, but maybe one of the methods, of course, might be, hey, has anyone here, either yourself or anyone close to you, ever had someone who is a victim of sexual assault? Could you please stand up? How many of you people did the person close to you, was that reported to police? Was it reported to police right away? Was that something they told you right away? And helping a jury appreciate, even if we don't have an opportunity to keep those panel members because they can't be fair, that sort of exposure is really going to help the other panel members understand, oh, this idea or my expectation about how these things are disclosed or how they're reported, it doesn't even match with the experiences of people that sat in this jury pool with me. And again, sort of, this is just a listing of case complexities that we might want to ask the jury to consider and explore. And again, there's sample questions about how to develop these different areas. When the defense is, of course, doing their jury selection, great opportunity to analyze their defense, listening to questions they're asking, and figure out how the defense maybe is framing their theory. Now, folks were talking earlier about expert witnesses, and that's a great thing. And that's as a way to explain victim responses. And so I sometimes call these types of witnesses victim behavior experts. And when we're utilizing victim behavior experts, again, this is something we could take a deeper dive into that we're just sort of going to be flying over right here. We want to identify responses that need explaining and maybe use expert witnesses to explain the experiences they have of working with victims. And the thing we're trying to do necessarily is not help our jury understand or educate our jury that there's a typical response from a victim, but that there is not a normal response from victims. In other words, there can be a range of responses of victims and a range of behaviors in response to sexual violence. So we're not so much using our victim behavior experts to persuade a jury like, hey, the victim responded this way. That's proof that they were raped. What we're using our victim behavior experts for is to help a jury understand that, hey, look, just because our victim reacted this way, that's not atypical. There's not a normal response. And so you shouldn't use this victim response as a reasonable doubt. In fact, you using this victim response to decide what's proven, if you use it to decide that we didn't prove our case, that would be an unreasonable doubt. And a good victim behavior expert can just educate the jury about the spectrum and range of jury responses rather than trying to get a jury to understand that a certain response is confirmatory of sexual assault. Sometimes our victim might be able to articulate what happened. Sometimes other witnesses might be able to just talk about their experience working with victims and helping a jury understand. Now, experience is going to be what qualifies you an expert, and there's a wide range of people who have experiences working with a wide variety of victim behavior experts. Of course, the more expensive route and involved route is going to be the forensic psychiatrist or psychologist, which is a great resource, but it could also be advocates. It could be SANE, your sexual assault nurse examiner, anyone who has experience working with victims regularly. So we're at the tail end. I see we're hitting 3:30 Eastern time. I know there's folks from other time zones here. So what I want to do is just sort of wrap this up going forward. We want to recognize the dangerousness of known offenders, use that to inform our prosecution strategies and our decisions to prosecute. We want to find that evidence of predatory behavior, both with the victim in our case and other victims, and identify that evidence and collect it. We want to be looking for ways to support our victim and witness credibility with corroborating evidence, and we want to recreate the reality of the crime at trial. So folks, this is my contact information. We are at 3:30 Eastern time right now. Certainly, I'm going to make sure that folks here can get a copy of the PowerPoint. That'll be available to you because, as I indicated, there is an appendix with a variety of maybe offender interview questions or cross-examination questions, some samples of voir dire questions that this could be something you utilize in your practice. But of course, it'll only be good for you if you have a copy of the PowerPoint. So we're going to make sure that's distributed to you afterwards. A recording of this webinar is going to be available, hopefully not in the too far future, on our YouTube channel. I just want to go through the Q&A section here, make sure I didn't miss anything. So one person asked, I've not seen this, but can prosecutors ask for discovery for defense? I'm sorry. Well, that's not a stupid question. But for the person who asked that question about if prosecutors can ask for discovery from defense, in some limited circumstances, certainly if the defense has an expert witness, but a lot of the particulars of that's going to depend on one's local jurisdiction. Is there specific behavior that law enforcement prosecutors should look for, prior bad behavior other than sexual assault? Well, I certainly think if there's other criminal activity involving the same victim, that's going to help prove a force or implicit force. All right, so folks, I just wanted to check those questions, but that I think pretty much wraps up our presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for what you do. I'm going to hang on in case there's any other questions. So I'll try to be the last person to leave, but thank you everyone for your attention and listening to this presentation today. All right, folks. I'm going to be ending the presentation. Thank you all so much for your attention. Take care.